Earlier this month, we at the News Forum asked Canada's top university presidents if calling for the genocide of Jews would violate their student code of conduct policies. But we were not the only ones looking for an answer to that question. MPs Anthony Housefather, Marco Mendicino, David Lametti, Anna Gainey, and Ben Carr asked that same very question. Those MPs emailed the top 27 universities in Canada to get clarification on the question that is increasingly important given the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada. Joining us now to discuss the response of those universities is Anthony Housefather, Member of Parliament for Mount Royal. Anthony, thank you for coming back on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me, David.
So how many of the universities that you reached out to responded to your request? And more importantly, how did they respond?
So the good news is that all 27 of the universities, we went to the 27 biggest Canadian universities, those that had 20,000 students or more, all of them responded by the deadline that we gave them of January the 20th. I know that Universities Canada was very much involved in coordinating with the universities and assisting them. I understand there were a number of meetings between the presidents of universities. Our letter really woke them up to the issue and to the fact that the House of Commons and people in the House of Commons were interested in their responses. And all 27 confirmed that the call for the genocide against Jews would be a violation of their code of conduct, irrespective of context. So that was a very, very big part of the whole framework, given what happened in the United States. And I was gratified to see the answer. On the rest, we have publicly given out a Google Drive where everyone can look at the answers and judge for themselves. Students, faculty, staff, those that are working with those universities can see how they responded and use the promises and commitments they made in those letters to help you on the ground. But I would say that while there was some divergence in answers, some answers were definitely more complete and better than others, the majority of the universities, the vast majority, did a very good job in terms of providing comprehensive responses and certainly showing that they've stepped up their game to take further measures to protect students, faculty, and staff on campus.
And in our previous conversation, you had mentioned that there may be a need for Parliament to formally investigate the rise of anti-Semitism on campus. Is some sort of hearing something that you're still looking for after these answers have been sent to you?
So that'll be a question for the committee. I believe that the Justice Committee should still do hearings on the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada. The campuses were one part of that. And I think we should still pay attention to what's happening on the campuses and hear from people about what's happening on campuses. But the need to grill the presidents in the way that they did in the United States is clearly not required in the sense that they've all at least responded to this question. It doesn't mean that, for example, I wouldn't want to hear from some of the university presidents that are doing a really good job at this to give Canadians advice on what all universities and colleges and CEGEPs should be doing across the country. I still think that public hearings, having this in the public square, letting people hear what's happening, and of course, hearing from students as well, it remains important. But I mean, this letter was an effort to, well, I don't want to just wait for the hearings. Let's see what we can get them to do. Yeah. And again, I have to admit, I think maybe you were too, David, I was surprised that all 27 answered, because this didn't even come from a parliamentary committee. It came from 5 individual MPs. So, I was happy. I was surprised and happy.
And I think for many, it's rather refreshing that Canadian university presidents responded to you directly and directly to the question. That said, I'm curious on your view here, if these universities are living up to that standard. I know that you mentioned that others can kind of judge the universities based on what you've published, but I'm curious on your view if they're living up to those standards.
So I think different universities, again, the answer would be different, right? Right now, they need to recognize there's a problem. I think the vast majority of them have recognized there's a problem. They need to take additional steps to look at their existing codes of conduct and determine whether they were sufficient or not and what new measures need to be taken. For example, should the universities be allowing any demonstrations in the center of their campuses? or should they, I mean, because there's no requirement to, if they're going to permit demonstrations on campus, have them right in the center where people need to go through potentially explosive demonstrations when they walk to class. You can have them at different parts of your campus where it's not right in the middle. There are a number of universities that have been looking at that.
I want to
Others look.
pick back up on that when we come back from the break. Stay with us. We'll be back with Anthony Housefather. Anthony, before the break, you were mentioning these explosive demonstrations and the debate on maybe where the appropriate place is for that type of demonstration on campus. How do we balance free expression and the right to protest in a university setting?
Well, I think just like anywhere else, right? There's a normal level of requiring permits when you have demonstrations in a municipality. You let police know where you're going to be. You ensure that you're doing it in a secure location. And I think, again, it's very important to be allowed to demonstrate, but there's not a requirement to allow demonstrations in each and every location. And I think that the real question is, you could have a protected space that a university sets aside for demonstrations that doesn't require everybody going to their classes to walk through it.
Or
And
preventing students from being able to get into class or to a cafeteria or
exactly,
any, yeah.
exactly. Like, I mean, like, for example, as we both know, right? When you're demonstrating a policy of a government, demonstrating outside of a government building, demonstrating outside of parliament, that is entirely reasonable. Demonstrating outside an office building that has nothing whatsoever to do with the issue that you're demonstrating about simply because you don't like the ethnic group of the owner is not okay. And people have a right to go to work and not be blocked there. So I think the location of the demonstration is always important, both in the judgment of the demonstrators that they should be using good judgment, but
Right.
also in the right, I believe, of the institution to designate certain protected spots for demonstrations and say, this is where, when you demonstrate, you can demonstrate, but you're not allowed to block other students from going to class, or other faculty have to go into class. And that again, I think universities are thinking about. I also think they're again thinking about the interactions they've had over the last few months where they've run into trouble, and I think are reevaluating, as you see in these letters, what it is that they need to do to ensure codes of conduct are respected by student associations, for example.
Yeah.
And and the public nature of these letters means that those working at that campus can now see what the university is committed to. And if they're not following what they said in the letter, you can point to the letter and say, you've committed to this and you're not doing it.
Yeah, you
So
can hold them
I
account
think
to account on their own words. But I also want to ask you here, there are, of course, major questions about what is and what isn't considered calling for the genocide of Jews. And that sounds like a radical thing to say out loud, but we've seen many slogans like Intifada, from the river to the sea. And depending on who we've spoken to, the interpretations of those slogans vary significantly. How do we interpret those slogans in the context of what's going on right now, if they cross the line, if they fit into this bucket of calling for the genocide of Jews?
Right. So again, I think calling for the genocide of Jews is a criminal act in Canada. In my view, it's a violation of the criminal code. It's permitted under Keekstra, which is the case that decided what hate speech was or was not permitted. And when you have ambiguous slogans, which to Jews and those who, many others, seem genocidal, it's harder to prove when the slogan is not overt, right? When you're
Mm-hmm.
saying from the river to the sea, I think Jews would interpret that as an effort to eradicate the state of Israel. But other people will claim it means something else. Now, in good taste and in respect of others, my view is that when you know that a slogan you're using is interpreted by people around you to be calling for their destruction, you wouldn't use that slogan. You would find other slogans. But I don't know that a university can simply on its own interpret that slogan as being hate speech. I think
Mm-hmm.
what we need is the provincial attorney generals to provide guidance under the criminal code. This is what police are waiting for. I talked to the Toronto police chief last week. They're waiting for the attorney generals of the provinces to provide them with guidance as to where the line is crossed.
Yeah.
And I think that my call would be for the federal and provincial attorney generals to get together to determine where the line is crossed, have a common view across the country, and to issue clear directives as to how to interpret the criminal code to police to universities and to others. Until then, you're going to always have this ambiguity.
Well,
But but
yeah.
but again, there's an important thing though. Hate speech is one thing. Hate speech is not permitted. But hateful speech, which is what I think you could say from the river to the sea, is
Mhm.
because the people chanting it know that other people interpret that as calling for their destruction, whether or not that was the intention. Everybody who's yelling it knows that.
Yeah.
You can find other words to say the same thing, that I want a free Palestine. I
Sure.
want two states. And
Yeah.
without saying from the river to the sea, you could, and I think we all should, when we're chanting things at demonstrations, be cognizant of how those words make others feel.
Of course. Anthony, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.